All right, Christofer here. Welcome to the first episode of 2022. I hope you've had a great start to the new year. So this is just a short intro to introduce the new series I'm doing with Jake Orthwein called the Chapman series. It's basically just me and Jake nerding out real hard on specific ideas from David Chapman's books, Meaningness and In the Cells of the Eggplant. And as always, when I'm trying to learn something new, I need to talk about it, ask a lot of silly questions. I want to hear the same ideas reiterated over and over again from different angles. And so these episodes are not going to be perfectly structured and geared towards the general listener. It's a selfish attempt to understand these ideas better. And so we reserve the right to get real technical, really nerdy, and be a little all over the place. But hopefully you can get some enjoyment out of it too. And if you are interested in the ideas, remember to ask questions when we go out on Twitter so that you can be part of the discussion as well. All right, let's break our brains. All right, so I'm here today with Jake Orthwein. How you doing, buddy?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So Jake and I, we've had a few conversations before where we've touched on some of the work of David Chapman. And in the first episode when we spoke, I think I was kind of adverse to the ideas and I just wanted to show where they were wrong. And then in the second episode, you actually piqued my interest quite a bit. And since then, I've taken the time per your recommendation to actually go and read Chapman's stuff straight from the source there. So I've read his 2 books over Christmas holiday here. And I really enjoy it. I think it's very interesting. And I wanted to give us more time than we've had before and maybe a little more structure to actually dive deeper into separate parts and really hash out certain things together there. So super happy that you're here and willing to be the oracle for me here.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And I should just give a sort of caveat up front that, I'm a big fan, obviously, of Chapman's work and spend a bunch of time trying to understand it. But I don't want to give the misimpression that this is the sort of canonical view. We'll get into some of some sort of intellectual backdrop for it and ways of understanding it. They're mostly like my attempts to understand it well, and any errors are also mine, and shouldn't be taken as a substitute for going and reading Chapman himself.
Yes. No, that's great. And let's also then give a shout out to Chapman on 2 fronts. Firstly, I'm really happy he's doing the work in the first place. It's really fun to read, and I've actually gotten some psychological use for his work on meaningness already. So it's cleared up some things for me, which has been very useful. And then also he's been very endorsing of what we're doing here, it seems like. And he's also been willing to talk to us to prepare for this a little bit. So thanks a lot, David, if you listen to this. It's awesome. We're going to start today discussing a few different things, namely cognitivism, representationalism, and rationalism. And I'm not really sure exactly how to define them. They bleed into each other here. They are all relevant. I'm not sure how much we need to differentiate them for the purpose of this discussion. But I can just say that I'm coming from the perspective of having a bachelor's degree in cognitive science, and also being very enamored with the David Deutsch stuff these last 2 years. I've kind of been working with some assumptions here from the ideas of cognitivism and the likes. And I haven't really questioned that a lot. And there are a few things that are problematic with these kind of views. And so this is kind of to take a step back and maybe perform a little exorcism of some of my questions and see where we end up with that.
Yeah. I mean, so just to give people a little bit of like a orienting frame. So, in these conversations, we've been sort of explaining David Chapman stuff to people who are coming from broadly like a David Deutschian worldview, and the key pieces of that worldview are the really key piece is critical rationalism, which is a sort of epistemological view coming out of a philosophical tradition. But then he melds it in Beginning of Infinity with views about a sort of computational theory of mind. And so just the idea that what the mind is doing is fundamentally computation, a certain kind of information processing. And as he sort of melds those two ideas of critical rationalism as an epistemology and a computational theory of mind, he sort of, to my ear, takes on board certain assumptions from early cognitive science and sort of early computational ways of thinking about the mind, which fall broadly under this banner of cognitivism. So to sort of define terms for people, cognitivism was sort of a reaction to behaviorism in the early days of psychology. So there was a sort of taboo around thinking about cognition or thinking about anything that wasn't directly observable as behavior. And the so-called cognitive revolution in cognitive science said, no, actually, there's something happening in between. It's not just stimulus and response. There's something happening in between there. There's cognition. There's some sort of processing happening. And suddenly, that sort of assertion mixed with things that were being discovered about information and computation gave people a language for thinking about, okay, what's going on in the head, so to speak, or what's going on in the mind that isn't just directly observable behavior, that isn't just blind stimulus response association. And so this sort of cognitive revolution was born. But there are assumptions in that initial cognitivist view, specifically about cognition is primarily a matter of having models of the world, representations of the world over which you perform computations, and then you execute plans, hierarchical plans to achieve goals. That's sort of like a loose sense of what the cognitive agent is from the standpoint of cognitivism. And there are various ways in which that's been challenged later, and certainly the Chapman material assumes a lot of that stuff to be, or doesn't assume, but argues for a lot of that stuff to be wrong. And so there's a relationship between cognitivism as the sort of psychological view, or this approach in cognitive science, and rationalism as a piece of the philosophical tradition. And both of them are sort of in a kind of Cartesian lineage, so cognitivism took on board a lot of assumptions from philosophical rationalism, and representationalism, just to put that third term in play, is a common feature to the two of them, the philosophical view and the sort of psychological view. So anyway, that's just to get those terms out there, and then we'll get into what some of the issues are.
Right. No, that's a wonderful overview, actually. And like you've told me before, there are a lot of different entry points to this. And I think you told me the other day that the way you got it, because there's a flip to be had here. This is what I'm kind of after here for my own purposes, where I've heard David Chapman say it himself, and I've heard you talk about it. And I think there's a fancy word for it as well that I've practiced saying before this. But there's a flip in thinking about these things, where you kind of go from this cognitivist, representationalist view of the world, which seems kind of obvious and unproblematic. That it still does to me to some extent. I mean, I have these objections. I've read some of the stuff, so I have some objections in mind, but I'm still I'm not clearly feeling the problems here, and I can't really see why it just doesn't work the way that I've thought it worked before, right? And so I'm kind of after picking at the seams here and see if I can invoke this kind of flip, where all of a sudden it supposedly looks very untenable, so that people like you and people like Chapman are really pushing these new ideas forward and these critiques, right?
Yeah, so there is this sort of flip in understanding when you start with this cognitivist representationalist view, and Chapman refers to it in the book as the ethno-methodological flip. This is in his meta-rationality book. Ethno-methodology is just a field that sort of approaches the study of human behavior and cognition, and sort of without making a hard distinction between those two, but through this particular understanding, which is that the place to find the intelligibility of human behavior and cognition is in publicly observable behavior of various kinds, and we can get into why that is. So, like, but it's a flip from thinking about cognition as something primarily happening inside the head, that is the result of forming internal representations of the world and then carrying out plans on the basis of those, to an understanding of cognition that's much more about dynamic interaction in a social world, in an embodied context, etc. So that's the flip. But getting there, we may sort of hold off on that and just start with, okay, what are the assumptions of cognitivism, rationalism, representationalism, and then where do some of those assumptions become problematic, and then maybe in the next episode we can get into here some proposed sort of solutions to that. Although I'm sure we'll get into both this time.
Yeah. No, I like that. And I'm going to reserve my usual right to interrupt you.
Please.
So I can clarify things when I can't follow along there.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, maybe a good place to start would just be to outline these things as they show up in the Deutschian view, right? So it's sometimes a little bit unclear to me, how much Deutschians run together the epistemological view of critical rationalism with a sort of philosophy of mind view of, like, this is what minds, are doing, how they function in general, versus this is how they function when they're doing a certain kind of thinking. But the broad view is that you have ideas. Those ideas are conjectures, in the sense that they're guessed. They're not formed on the basis of justified certainty of any kind. They're guesses about what's there in the world. So they're representational in that sense. They're supposed to model the world as it is in various ways. And you notice those ideas to be in conflict. When you start with certain ideas and you conjecture new ideas, and then, those ideas come into conflict, they have different implications, whatever. And problem solving, which is sort of the essence of progress in this view, consists of noticing when you have ideas that are in conflict, and then conjecturing new ideas, new explanations in the best case, that resolve the contradictions between your ideas. And so a sort of evolution happens where, bad ideas are falsified away, or subjected to criticism until new ideas take their place that resolve the problems that existed with the sort of previous collection of ideas. Does that comport with your understanding?
Yes. Yeah, and I would just add to that perhaps that this is not only on the conscious level. I mean, I know at least Deutsch has stressed a lot how you have this happening at an unconscious level, an explicit level, and explicit level, where I think he would say that it's only the worst offenders in terms of conflicts that ever becomes conscious. And I also think it's important to stress that the view that the mind is some kind of a big coherent thing, or a slew of coherent propositions or something, this view is very opposed to that. It's contradictory by nature, which was basically what you said there. But I just want to stress that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the sort of contradictions are the engine of progress, right? So there's no sort of condition of total error-free, coherence. But yeah. Okay, so I do. We'll get into this a little bit later, but I think there's a lot lurking behind that sense of, okay, this could be happening, but it's inexplicit, because what exactly inexplicit means, other than just not conscious, is a little bit tricky. And
right.
The arguments that I'm going to want to make about problems with representationalism are going to point to a lot of those things that Deutschians will say are quote unquote implicitly representational in some sense.
Right. Including me in our first episode. And I just want to say that like when I hear you say this now, I'm smiling so hard. I think this is so enjoyable. I'm so happy we're doing this, man.
Good. Yeah. I mean, so it's just this is not just a Deutschian thing. This is a thing that happens throughout cognitive science. But there's like a little bit of a ambiguity about what's meant by explicit, what's meant by inexplicit, and how much are you buying yourself by just calling something inexplicit in sort of safeguarding the view from criticism. But anyway, we'll get into that. So so the way I just laid out that critical rationalist view, you can already hear some of these assumptions that are getting made, which is that the primary thing that minds are doing is forming representations of the world, and then behavior is a matter of sort of taking those representations, having goals, which are another kind of idea, and then executing plans to achieve the goals based on the understanding contained in those representations. Something like that. So does that sound broadly like
yes,
your view? Okay,
yeah, I would say so.
Okay, so one way of thinking about it is to break this out into the sort of view of action there, which is this planning view of action, and this view of representation there, which is this objective, what I tend to call like innocent view of representation, which is that like none of the contexts and purposes and characteristics of the embodiment of the agent are in any sense encoded in those representations. The representations are just about the world, and they mirror the world in some way, and the specifics about the agent and their context and what they can do with their body and all this stuff has nothing to do with how those things are represented, right? It's just information.
Right.
That information is substrate independent. The information is the representation, and I could take that same representation and put it in another agent, and it would be exactly the same because it's just information, right?
Right. So, I mean, if I take it back to my own situation then and how I'm thinking, if we dumb it down there, I'm just thinking that okay, so I'm a live agent, and right now, for instance, I am looking out into the world, and it seems very plausible to me, and it seems like a good idea to say that, okay, right now I'm getting in sense signals from the world, and these are then electrical crackles in my nervous system that gets transmuted, and then my brain forms some kind of a interpretative model there and builds up from that, and then I get this kind of VR embedded view of the world here in terms of perception. And what I'm doing all the time is that I'm taking input as predictions, and I'm comparing that with my model to see if it makes sense, and then I update my model. Now I'm sounding a little Bayesian, but what I mean is this conjecture criticism thing that you outlined there before.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if we start there, why isn't it about model building? It seems very intuitive that what our brains do, humans' brain do especially well, is trying to model their environment, because that has a huge evolutionary advantage to be able to do that. And it seems like objectively representing the world might be the best way to do that.
Yes.
What's wrong with this?
Okay, yeah. So just to be clear, I'm not saying we never do model building or something that could be reasonably called representation, but that's not the only thing we do, and that process is not innocent / objective / independent of embodiment and context and purposes, and the function of representation in many cases, what we call representation in many cases, is to direct a certain kind of action rather than to mirror the world in some perfectly objective sense. But let's get into it with perception, right? So
that's an important point. I'm glad you clarified that. Okay, so right.
Okay, so to take us back to the scene you just described. So one assumption made in cognitivism is that there's this kind of firewall between action and perception and cognition, that the cognition is this sort of self-contained thing that isn't dependent on perception and action. I think the view you sketched there is that cognition / perception is one thing and action is discrete. And the view that I'm going to sketch here says cognition, perception, and action are all bound up with each other, and are not separable.
So is this?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So is this? Because I've heard you say before. I think the last time we spoke, you said something like, we spoke about how you thought Deutsch is super fine with the idea of a brain in a vat.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And is that kind of the issue we're talking about here?
Yes. So I think perception is meaningfully different from what you're doing when you're thinking about things that are not in your immediate environment, such that just saying they're both virtual reality, they're both conjectures about what's out there, equally sort of uncoupled from the phenomenon, I think misses a lot. Okay, so what's going on in perception, and you can notice this by just saying, let's take, a quintessential perceptual thing that's going on, which is like you're looking at whatever's in front of you on your desk or something, and then let's take what's happening when you're thinking about the capital of another country. Okay, now I'm going to say that when you're perceiving your desk in front of you, there's a loop happening between you and the immediate environment that you're embedded in. Okay, between perception and action and cognition, such that that's constantly passing back and forth between you and the world, such that as things change in your immediate environment, your behavior changes and your quote unquote representation of what's out there is changing. Okay, so it's coupled. I'm going to use this phrase, causally coupled to the environment, such that when the environment changes, your representation of it changes, right? In an immediate sense, in an ongoing dynamic way, right?
Yeah.
The reason for that is because you're actually causally coupled to the environment. The environment is acting on you physically, through light signals and whatever else, such that you're and you're behaving. You're taking that feedback and then behaving in certain ways. So you hear a sound that causes you to look where that sound is coming from, which causes you to hear it more. And there's this sort of coupling between perception and action and representation and the environment out there, what's happening in the world. That's looping back and forth. The causality sort of looping back and forth between your mind and the world constantly, right? It's not just in the mind first, executed behavior, and then these kind of minor updates. It's this ongoing dynamic interaction between you and the world. Okay. Now, to take the other kind of representation, Paris is the capital of France or something like that. Whatever that's referring to could change enormously right now, and your representation wouldn't change because it's not coupled to the phenomenon in the world causally, right? In any direction.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So if they change the capital of France tomorrow, you would not change your representation of it until something happened to you that caused you to change it. Like somebody told you they changed the capital of France. Okay. So yes. Your relationship to the phenomena in your immediate environment that you're perceiving is different in the sense of being causally coupled and engaged in ongoing dynamic interaction than your representation of what the capital of France is. Okay, your relationship to that phenomenon. Okay, and so something is different.
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So no, that makes sense to me. But so then, what's the issue with saying in the perceptual case there with the direct causal connection that, yeah, you're getting that input from the environment.
Yep.
But what that and that requires me to update my model in a different way and more often and more directly than this more abstract piece of knowledge that I have. But why couldn't you just explain that in the same kind of conjecture criticism? Is that one of the problems, that it generalizes over too many circumstances and thus becomes kind of vague and loses explanatory power somehow? Or is it directly opposed to?
It's definitely too vague to sort of explain some of the details, but it's importantly wrong in certain senses. So, okay. So when you become when you become knowledgeable about what's going on in Paris, the account of how that happened is not confined to your body or your mind, let alone your head, right? It is a socially distributed process that you depend upon to connect your mind to the world in that sense. Okay, it's not confined to your head. It's not a matter of you making a conjecture about it. It's a whole distributed set of social practices that result in you being able to think, oh, they changed the capital of France. Okay. And in a perceptual case, it's not even in your head there, right? It's dependent upon the environment. So when you're going to give an explanation of the computations that are happening that cause you to be thinking thoughts about the world, in either of those cases, it's different in both cases, but in both cases, it's not confined to your head, and it's not a matter of you making. It's not the connectedness to the world is not a matter of you just happening to have gotten the guess right. It's a matter of interaction among many moving parts in the perceptual case between you and the environment and your body and all this stuff, and the actions that you're taking and the feedback you're getting and all of that. And in the socially distributed case, in a whole sort of epistemic community. And both of these sort of run against the assumption that would be made in a sort of traditional cognitivist frame, which is that cognition is, there's actually a list that I can sort of read you, but it's like cognition is in a traditional cognitivist frame, cognition is thought of as being individual. It's thought of as being abstract. It's thought of as being sort of like disconnected, which is to say, like this firewall I was talking about between perception and action, and cognition. There are all these sort of assumptions that get challenged. It's independent of your particular embodiment. There are all these assumptions that get challenged by this view. Right. Tell me if I'm making sense.
Yeah. I think this is super interesting. So, I know you've mentioned this before sometime that this kind of goes hand in hand with the other side of the coin that we're interested in here, which is the phenomenological experience and meditation and things like that, and the idea of duality versus non-duality, right? That in the critical rationalist type view or cognitivist view more generally, and this is how I've always viewed it, like I'm an agent interfacing with a world that's somehow separate from me, right? And if you truly feel like you are a separate thing behind your face looking out at something that's separate from you, rather than you being embedded in it non-dually, that kind of fuels this intuition, I would say.
Agreed.
Is it relevant here, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's not an accident that a lot of the Chapman stuff has Buddhist influences, right? But and it's not an accident that Francisco Varela, who's the guy who wrote the original book called The Embodied Mind, or one of the authors of that book, is a Buddhist, and so is at least one of the other authors of that book, and it's not an accident that there are these sort of convergences. Both of which are sort of undermining a kind of Cartesian view of both mind-body dualism and sort of subject-object dualism, agent-world dualism. There are all these different sort of dualisms that get challenged here. Okay, so let me backtrack a little bit. So I've got a couple different ways in. If you have questions, we can get to them. But I have a couple different ways in that I might try, and then I'm curious if laying a few of them out will sort of make some of the picture come into clearer view.
Yes, shoot down a power bar and give me all of them, man.
Okay.
I'm ready.
All right. So so we're talking about there's a sort of a cognitive science tradition here, and there's a philosophical tradition here. The cognitive science one is this view of cognitivism, and the philosophical one is this view of rationalism and a kind of Cartesian rationalism, right? Where thought is understood to be a sort of private mental activity that consists of a certain kind of abstract ratiocination. It's like abstract cognition, like logical reasoning, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, and one of the first places that this got challenged philosophically, or like sort of the strongest challenge to it that's a big influence on Chapman is Heidegger. Okay, so Heidegger sought a sort of reframing of the entire tradition of philosophy, which he thought had sort of gotten off on the wrong foot, partly because of these Cartesian assumptions. So what Heidegger did was he basically like looked at everyday activity and sort of analyzed it in a new way and said, this doesn't look like what you would expect it to look like if you were coming from this sort of rationalistic view. And so Heidegger's general account of human being and routine activity is that we're typically the default state is that we're engaged in certain projects, and the classic example that always gets used is like hammering a nail or something like that, right? So you're engaged in hammering a nail, and when you're engaged in that project, the way you relate to, say, the hammer is not as this sort of discrete object representation of hammer unto itself, right? Which is how the world appears from a kind of rationalist frame, that the world consists of objects that are themselves perfectly separable and definite and independent of us, right? And Heidegger would say, when you're engaged in the process of hammering, the way the hammer appears is not as some like discrete object, but rather as
part of your body.
If not exactly part of your body, part of the activity that you're engaged in of hammering, right? Like, and the way you're perceiving the world in the midst of hammering is, there's a certain sort of visual scene that seems relatively stable. I'm not trying to say that doesn't, and there's sort of object representations in that, but a key piece of how you're perceiving the world when you're hammering has to do with what are called the affordances for action for hammering. So like what you're directly seeing in the environment, what you can do next in some sense, right? And you can think about this like when you're learning to drive a car, right? When you're learning to drive I should say, okay, so then the next thing that happens when you're hammering is if you miss the nail or something else goes wrong, then the objectness of the hammer might make itself manifest to you, right? That like suddenly this thing that was previously just continuous with your ongoing, successful coping of hammering, becomes an object because it's become problematic, right? In some sense. And one way of thinking about this is that when you're learning to drive a car, every single little activity is just, you have to think about explicitly, right? Like, like every movement of your body, every turn signal, whatever else is, you have to like think of it in a serial steps and plans in an explicit way, right? When you learn to drive a car successfully, that's not happening anymore. You're just successfully driving the car, right? And to the extent that you're thinking about things, you're thinking about the next turn you want to make, not the kind of movement of your arms to steer the wheel. You know what I mean? Like all of that stuff just becomes procedure that you're successfully doing, and it's not a matter of like thinking about the car as an object when you're successfully driving. You know what I mean?
Right. It's just part of the flow of whatever action you're currently
and so
performing.
so the relevance here is to say that like in the midst of that kind of activity, you're not perceiving the world in terms of these ontological discrete object-like representations that according to a sort of rationalist view are the substance of your connectedness to the world. Like the reason why you're successfully behaving in the world on a rationalist view is that you have formed accurate representations of what the world is like. And looking at everyday activity in this way suggests that, well, no, it seems like what we're doing seems much more like coping with a world that we have affordance-like representations of, which is to say, we have representations of our actions, of possible actions within that world. And yes, sometimes we sort of drop back into a kind of view of the world as objects, but that's not the default. That's not the baseline upon which everything else is built. It's a flip in that sense. It's a flip from viewing the sort of object-like representation, rationalistic stuff as being fundamental, to viewing that as a sort of special case against the backdrop of what's usually just routine activity. Okay, I threw a lot at you. Let me know if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah. No, I like that. Okay, and so this is what we've discussed in, I think, our first podcast when we were talking about you were throwing around the word ontology, and I didn't understand what that meant.
Yeah, well, it's not your fault. It means different things in different contexts. Just to clarify,
okay.
what specifically is meant by ontology when I'm talking about it here is objectness. So like
how you cut up the world.
Yeah, exactly. How you cut up the world into objects, categories, properties, and relationships is
Yes. Okay. And so the big difference here is that the rationalist would say the way you cut up the world is you're trying to objectively describe it as much as possible, rather than cutting up the world in terms of what's most useful to you. What's the most useful way to cut up the world to take action in it?
Yeah, and
would
not
that be fair, or
yeah. So there are sort of two things happening and they're related. One is there's cutting up the world still into objects, but where the boundaries of those objects are still relevant relative to your context and purposes, right? So that's true. That happens, and we'll get into why that has to be true. You couldn't otherwise cut up the world into objects. But then there's an even deeper thing happening, which is that before you even get to thinking about the world as objects, you're thinking about affordances for action. Like, what can I do? And this goes back to like our earlier conversation about the amoeba, or these like very simple organisms that don't model the world in its own details, but they still have a certain kind of representation or something that gives them patterns of action in it that are successful.
I mean, like you said, we've touched on that specific way of talking about it before, but maybe you could just explain that one more time.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it could be useful in the context of what you've said so far.
Yeah. Okay. So just to orient people a little bit, what we're doing is we're building up a picture of abstract, quote unquote, rational cognition that is grounded in concrete activity, and specifically a kind of concrete activity that we do along with other organisms in the animal kingdom, right? So like this is another version of the flip that we were talking about before. Rather than say all successful action must explicitly or implicitly be the result of successful rational cognition, which is to say like abstract, propositional, representational, plan-based, etc. cognition. Rather than say that, you sort of flip that and say the more fundamental thing is concrete activity and sort of coping with the world, is this Heideggerian phrase, and abstract reasoning is a sort of specialized version of that. But one way of building that intuition is to start looking at much simpler organisms than we are. So take the simplest case: you have like an amoeba or some other like single-celled type organism, and it's got a membrane that constitutes its body, right? And what it's got to do is it's got to take in signals across that membrane from the outside, translate those signals into certain behaviors that are going to aid it in the process of maintaining its body, right? Like, to be alive for that single-celled organism is to keep up that membrane that is its body. And
yeah, it sounds fun.
Right. So
yeah.
And this is actually, when we get into talking about the self and all this stuff, I'm sure this will be later, but this all ends up still actually being relevant in an interesting way, right? Like it's not an accident that cognition in the very first instance, if you want to call it cognition, it's not really cognition in any kind of, specialized sense or something like that. But It's not an accident that in the very first instance, what that process is devoted towards is assisting an organism in the maintenance of its own embodiment, right? Continuing to be as
Right.
as a separate organism, right?
Yeah.
So what that organism has to do is to take in it has to have a boundary, but it has to be a permeable boundary. If it's not a permeable boundary, it's not taking in signals from the environment, and it's going to get killed. If it's an infinitely permeable boundary, it's going to be dead, right? Because then it's no longer maintaining a boundary to speak of, and so it's not a discrete organism anymore, right? So it's this sort of sweet spot of a boundary, but a permeable boundary, and this ability to regulate the signals that it gets from its environment and translate those into behaviors that are going to allow it to continue to do that, basically, to survive, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if you think about what that celled organism is, it's translating. So, okay. I don't know whether this applies to some specific organism, but imagine that it's like, it's got to consume salt of some kind in its environment. And so it's got to be able to detect on its membrane, there's salt in this direction, and then translate that into the behavior of swimming more in that direction so that it gets more salt.
Yep.
Okay. So that's basically like a reflex. And there's not what that goes straight from sensory input of salt in this direction to motor output of travel in that direction, without there being some thing in between that's a picture of the world, a model of the world in its full detail. It's just if this, then that. If salt on this part of the membrane, swim in that direction. So it's a translation from sensory input to motor output. Make sense?
Yes. No mediation in between. Yes.
Yeah, no intermediation. And you could think about that process getting a little bit more complex, right? So it's not just a reflex, but it's a more complex kind of input translating into a more complex kind of output with more kind of dependencies, or like more kind of contingencies embedded or something like that, where it's still fundamentally, there's something intermediating, but the thing intermediating is like a representation in terms of affordances for action. So it's like, the organism is representing there's something out there, but the way it's representing it is there's food out there, or like there's opportunities for grasping out there. That's like, one type of affordance representation. And so the key idea with that kind of representation, there's something graspable there, is that it's not objective in the sense of being independent of the properties of the agent. What's graspable for me is not what's graspable for you, is not what's graspable for an amoeba. Nothing is graspable for an amoeba. An amoeba is never going to have a representation of graspability, right? It doesn't
Right.
make sense because it's not that kind of organism. Okay. But that kind of representation, the kind that's about the affordances for action, the possibilities for action for that organism in that place at that time, is more fundamental and sort of earlier in the evolutionary tree and in development of an individual organism than is this abstract type of reasoning that we're calling representational. Okay?
Yes, and it seems more parsimonious. Less energy intensive than trying to actually objectively map everything
exactly. Yeah.
Out there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which nobody can do, right? Including you, right? And nobody can do that. So yes, you've got to have some way of coping with at least your local environment that doesn't depend on you being able to model every single atom in the universe, right? And for the single-celled organism, it doesn't even depend on being able to model anything at all. It's just a matter of having its embodiment reflecting certain successful patterns of interaction. Like it is the mechanism that translates this from the sensory input into the motor output. That's what its body is.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So you can just sort of move from that very simple case on down the evolutionary tree to more complex organisms until you get to us. And we have this thing that we're calling abstract cognition. Now, the weird tendency is to look at that and to say, oh, our abstract cognition, everything else that we do that's successful must be an instance of that secretly. And there's no good reason to assume that, right? Like there's no good reason to assume that the successful behavior of the single-celled organism is because somehow it's implicitly kind of approximating conjectures and refutations in a propositional, abstract reasoning sense. So we don't need that. You don't need that type of explanation. You've got an explanation in terms of mechanism, right? In terms of sensory motor interaction, right?
Yeah, so I lost you a little bit there, but do you? I mean, that type of process, would you still think it's fair to call the evolution of genetic knowledge conjecture and refutation, or
in a certain
trial
sense,
and error seems to be
in a certain sense, but not in the sense of representationalism and cognitivism. Like
right.
It's confusing to think about it that way when we're trying to highlight the problems with cognitivism. Yes, in a certain sense.
But could you?
Yeah.
Could you throw in, because you said there in the beginning, I think that I was giving this silly example of how I think I'm building models right now when I'm sitting in my room looking at stuff, and you said that model building is still a thing we do, and representation is still a thing.
Yep.
How does that tie into this picture and this chronology then? Maybe that can be helpful.
Yeah, so we'll get to that, but the flip is sort of viewing that kind of reasoning as a specialized version of this more fundamental coping style reasoning, and dependent upon that more fundamental coping style reasoning, rather than the paradigmatic case for every kind of successful activity in reasoning.
And that coping reasoning was more an affordance-based contextual.
Yes. It's heavily context and purpose dependent. It depends on perception is an instance of this, right? So like when you're perceiving something, and it's dependent on your local causal coupling to your environment, and getting that kind of constant feedback from your environment. And there's this phrase from Robotics, using the world as its own best model. It's like you don't need to model the world in all its detail, because it's there, and you can continually consult it in an ongoing way as you're acting. Okay.
But okay, wait.
Yeah.
Sorry, man, but no, so there you touched on something that I think is super interesting, which is the idea of, you have more of a direct access to the world, and I know the crit rats hate that way of speaking about it, like the empiricist alarm bells goes off, but. Yeah, I find that very interesting. I know Chapman wrote in one of his posts there that, like the value of perception, rather than objectively represent things, is to be more cost efficient, in the sense that you don't have to represent things, because you can just look, or you can just touch, or you can just
exactly
that I find very interesting. Can you explicate on that?
Yeah.
If it's relevant here.
Yeah, so that's what's meant by this phrase, using the world as its own best model, and not just perception, but in kind of action too. Like, you don't have to know what's over there if you reach over there and you bump into it, like that kind of stuff.
Right.
And the environment will tell you what's in it, or something like that. So in the extreme case, you have these robots that that will appear to be walking down the stairs, but there's nothing going on like representation in them. What's just happening is that they're bumping into the environment, and they have certain reflexes that turn that into the next action, and then that looks like walking downstairs. You know what I mean?
Right.
Or like it's like a slinky. A slinky is like the perfect example of this. Right?
Or me when I wake up. Yeah.
Yeah. You're right. But when you look at a slinky move down the stairs, right? It looks like, in this weird way, like it's like got some cognition or something like that, right? It's like going down the stairs, right? But all that's happening there is that it's just bumping into the environment, and that's leading to the next activity, which leads it to take the next step, which leads it to bump into the environment again, which leads it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good example.
So that I'm not saying what we're doing is the same as a slinky. Something much more complex is going on there, but I'm just saying, like, that gives you an intuition for how you might get something that looks like successful dynamic interaction with an environment that has nothing to do with making a model of it. It's like it has to do with bumping into that environment, right? Okay.
Could you because I know you did this for me, and it turned out, when we drilled down on what I think a representation is, that really got my head spinning. Like I hadn't really thought about that as deeply as I thought. Can you just explain what it means to have a representational model in between, or
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So
if you think it fits into it here, but it just helped me a
does.
little bit.
I sort of let me put a bow on the Heidegger point, and then we'll get to what a representation is.
Yes.
Okay. So just to clarify, we've gone from this view where what's considered sort of paradigmatic and quintessential for cognition is, abstract reasoning and planning, to a view where what's taken as fundamental is this more improvisational coping with your environment, dynamically interacting with it, representing it in terms of its affordances for action, rather than forming a model of it in itself, forming a plan as a sequence of explicit steps, and then carrying out that plan. The difference between those two views makes sort of sense. This improvisational, coping, routine activity, making breakfast type stuff, and
They're more chaotic and interactive.
Yeah, interactive being the key there. Yeah, and versus this abstract, form a model, on the basis of that model, form a plan, carry out the plan, and the sort of contingencies you get back from the environment are incidental because you're just carrying out a plan because you have a model, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's one of the things that we want to get out of the Heidegger view. Okay, now Chapman's PhD work, along with Phil Agre, was sort of about discovering that planning view did not work in AI, in robotics, right? So if you try to build a robot that works that way, that forms a sort of a plan, and within those plans are subplans, and within those plans are subplans and subplans and subplans, all the way down to I'm going to move my hand in this way, or my robot arm in this way, or whatever. That does not work, right? Because there's an unenumerable, and this will lead into your question about representation. There are unenumerably many facts about the environment that could turn out to be relevant to your ability to execute the plan that you cannot anticipate in advance. So if you're acting successfully in the world, depends on being able to form a plan that anticipates every possible contingency and then just execute it and hope for the best, right? You're fucked, because the environment, when you have to make that explicit enough for a computer, it turns out that the environment is so unutterably complex that some contingency will get in the way, right? So if you had to write a program for making breakfast that was so specific that nothing could go wrong, you would fail. Like, it's impossible, right? Right,
but you're so you're also saying then that and writing, since you cannot predict the infinite amount of things that can go wrong, you can't write like
a plan,
solutions to that, like subplans for whatever contingency that happens.
Yeah,
like that's also an infinite product. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, so this points toward a more general problem as it was discovered in AI and cognitive science, with this cognitivist / planning view of cognition in action, which is that it runs into these what are called combinatorial explosions, combinatorics problems, where what you'd seem to have to know to act successfully in this way, it requires anticipating an infinite number of contingencies that you could never successfully represent as a finite being, right? Like if you were going to really successfully execute complex multi-step plans that anticipated every possible contingency of acting in a real world with all its messiness, the complexity of that would be so much that it couldn't be run on any computer,
and
the combinatorial explosion is as you start adding these things together, the number of possible outcomes just gets larger and larger and larger until it explodes, and it's exponential, and you can't do it, right? So listeners to our previous episodes will remember this reference to what's called the frame problem. The frame problem refers to that fact. There was a sort of specific instance of it, but the more general instance of it is these sort of relevance problems, or these combinatorial explosion problems that are faced by this particular model of thinking and action. Okay. So we saw how it would be the case with the planning. So your hierarchical plans with subplans and subplans and subplans could not successfully anticipate every possible contingency that you're going to face in the world. If you tried to do that, it would be combinatorial explosive. So you're not doing that. That's the planning. That's the action view. Now let's move to the representation view, because the same thing is true of that kind of representation. Are you with me?
Yep.
Okay. All right, cool. So, okay. So suppose you wanted to take a sort of cognitivist view of how you form object representations of the world, and categories and things like that. The tacit assumption there is that those divisions are sort of pre-given in the world, right? That the world just comes divided into cups and tables and chairs and whatever else that you carve it up into. And so what you've got to do is you've just got to make the right guess for what those divisions are. And if your guess is right and they mirror the world, you're good, right? When you're coming up with categories, it's because just objectively it's the case that all the things that are cups share a certain number of attributes and are different, and that things that aren't cups don't share, and so those things just belong in the same category, right? Those things that share those attributes, right? That's the sort of intuitive version of it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That can't work. So to take the categories case, take any two things that are cups. There are an infinite number of things that those two things that share that are irrelevant to the fact that they're both cups, right? The fact that they're both not pianos has nothing, or I should say that's not bad. That's not a good example, because that is sort of relevant to the fact that they're cups. But like the fact that they're both, say they both happen to be made of plastic, that's not the relevant piece of them being cups, because you can have two not plastic things that are also cups, right?
Yeah.
So there are an infinite number of things that they share that are irrelevant to their category membership. Further, there's an infinite number of things that they don't share, ways in which they're different, that are also irrelevant to the fact that they are in the same category of cups. So just enumerating what properties they share and don't share, and then comparing, does not answer the question for you, are these things both cups? Right? Because for any explicit list you want to make of the attributes that define all and only cups, I can give you an example of a cup that doesn't meet those.
Yeah.
Right?
So the way to represent has to be grounded out in this type of affordance for the particular organism and context.
Yes. And the objects that make themselves apparent to me do so, are so parsed, are sort of divided in the way that they are, because of the kind of organism, the particular kind of organism that I am, right? So the fact that a cup is a cup for me has a lot to do with the uses to which I would put cups. And, the fact that, things that are cups broadly tend to be graspable for an organism roughly of my size, you know what I mean? And that they can be drunk out of for me, an amoeba can't drink out of a cup. So, you know what I mean? So like the ability to take this sort of infinite complexity of the world at the sort of physics level and turn it into these chunked, discrete objects. The way that I do that depends on what kind of organism I am. It's not just pre-given in the world. In the same way that graspability is not pre-given in the world, being a cup, that being divisible as a cup, or any other ontology you would want to give, is not pre-given in the world. The world doesn't answer that question for you by itself. You have to bring your context and purposes to it.
Right, and that's where we got a little stuck there. I got stuck on this last time, or first time we spoke about this. as I interpreted you to say something like, so it's relative, basically. Like we're still saying that whatever we are carving up as a cup, it exists. There's an object there, but the way we cut it up and perceive it and use it is specific to us and not objectively the right way to do it, or the one way to represent, or
yeah, certainly not the one way to represent it, right? It's not even the one way to represent it for you. There are 100 ways that you could represent a given scene. Depending on what your purposes are or something,
but it's so counterintuitive with the cup, because it's actually it's an object created by us for a specific purpose, right?
Yes,
but it's easier to see with something like a rock that doesn't have like I guess from the crit red perspective, they would say, it instantiates certain knowledge.
Yeah. Okay. But that point is actually extremely, extremely important. So you're right that a cup is different than a rock that you would just find in the environment, in that we've fashioned it to be the way that it is. But this actually speaks to the thing that we were talking about earlier about cognition not being confined to the head. What we're constantly doing as human beings is shaping our environment, which in turn shapes our reactions to it, which in turn shapes our environment, which in turn shapes our reaction to it. In the same way, like niche construction in evolution, right? You make your niche a particular way, which changes the selection pressures it exerts on you, which changes the niche, and ongoing and ongoing and ongoing, mutually constituting relationships. So we make the world such that it embeds our context and purposes, right? If you look at a city from 10,000 feet or whatever, and compare it to its surrounding area that is natural wilderness or something like that, the city is going to be organized into grid-like lines, and it's going to be discretely chunked in various ways, because that makes it more easily navigable and intelligible for us, in some sense.
Right.
So it's like we make the world that way so that it's easier for us to relate to and think about in that way, and so on and so on, right? You're right to notice that the cup is unique in embedding so many of our contexts and purposes, because we've partly made it that way. But I'm just saying, like, it's not just that we've made the world that way. It is partly that, plus this feature that's how we do object perception, is by having certain contexts and purposes. Anyway, yeah.
Yep. But and I know this was a Twitter question, I think, from Kasra, which was something along the lines of, you had mentioned that we were not a general purpose kind of. That's not what's going on in our brains, from Chapman's view. Is that something that could help elucidate this? Because that's something I'm not clear on.
Yeah.
Like contrasting it with the Deutschian view of this one universal creative program that is uniquely identified to be the mind and the thing humans do. And it's a general purpose thing, right? And that's why we can do so much more, so exponentially much more than chimpanzee. Like where does this tie in here? Because that's something that's kind of a loose end for me.
Okay, so I sort of hear a few different things there, and you can tell me how they're how you see them as being related. So there's Deutsch's claim, I think on as justified by computational universality, that anything that is thinkable by us, right? So we are universal computers, in the Church-Turing sense, and so and thinking is just computation, and so there can't be something that is thinkable that isn't thinkable by a universal computer, and we are such a computer.
Yes, but I think he distinguishes between computational universality of the Turing kind, and then explanatory universality, which doesn't follow from that. But which we also seem to have.
Yeah. So the one I just described, I think, is computational universality. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think his explanatory universality argument is that everything is explainable, and to not be would be a claim for the supernatural, right? So that's different than saying anything that is thinkable by us because we're universal computers. He's going to say, every natural phenomenon is explicable or something like that. Like every phenomenon that is explicable.
Yeah, it's akin to a supernatural argument to say that some things can affect us, but we can't explain why, but we can explain some other parts.
Yeah.
And also epistemologically that whatever thing we explain, we can always ask the question, why that? Why this way? And yeah, it would be foundationalism if we just reached an end all of a sudden where we couldn't ask that question. Or something like that. It was a long time ago I actually thought about it, but
yeah, okay. So there are those two sort of specific Deutschian claims, and then there's more general sort of like question of like, are we general purpose reasoners, right? Like is the reason that we're doing just like general in some sense. So remember how I was saying that there are these sort of like lists of things. I have the list in front of me now, so I can list you these attributes of the sort of classical cognitivist view.
Right.
So those characteristics are that it's individual. We talked about that one. The person themselves, the individual solitary person, is the locus of cognition, and we talked about how that's not really clear how you would explain something like you're knowing that Paris is the capital of France without giving a sort of account of some socially distributed process, right? So to say nothing of your interchange with an environment. So the individual assumption has sort of been challenged. There's rational, which is that deliberative conceptual thought is sort of the exemplar of cognition. And we talked about how that's not the case. There's this sort of coping style, affordance representation stuff that's more fundamental than abstract rational cognition. There's this quality of being abstract in the sense of being independent of the implementation, like what kind of body the organism is in. So that, Deutsch will put this under the banner of the sort of substrate independence of information processing. But I think that gets run together with a claim that the algorithm being executed is sort of independent of the implementation, which doesn't make any sense. But anyway, so there's that quality of being abstract. There's being detached, which is this perception and action and cognition are sort of all inseparable boxes,
Right.
And then the final one, and this is why I'm reading this list, is that it's general. And in the book it says, general in the sense that cognitive science is taken to be the search for universal principles of general intellection, true of all individuals and applicable in all circumstances. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. None of those are true. And so all of those are challenged by the sort of view that we're sketching here, which is, broadly the view of like what's called 4E cognitive science, or embodied, embedded, extended, and enactive cognitive science. Situatedness is another term for it. And so you can take each of those views and challenge, the individual, nope, social, the detached, nope, it's embodied. There are all these ways that you can challenge that. So now we'll deal with the sort of general claim that cognition is fully general.
Yes.
Clearly, that's not true in the case of the amoeba, right? That what it's doing reflects general principles of cognition that are representational, right?
No.
Right. So, but it's something like cognition in the sense that it's successful coping with the world. So and when we talked about how that can get more complex without, becoming abstract reasoning, sort of rational reasoning. All right. So the way Chapman parses all of this stuff in his meta-rationality book is he does a kind of remodeling of the concepts here to clarify the important distinctions he wants to make. So this is not the way everybody uses these terms. This is the way he uses these terms in the meta-rationality book, for the particular purpose of clarifying some of these distinctions that otherwise are just sort of implicit. So he makes a threefold distinction between reasonableness, rationality, and meta-rationality. Okay. And reasonableness, but by reasonableness, he means what we've been referring to under the banner in this conversation of routine activity. So it has to do with heavily context and purpose laden, tightly coupled loops between perception and action, coping with a local environment type activity like making breakfast. Okay.
Yeah, so more bouncing into the world than representing it objectively.
Right, exactly. Another word to put in play here is this idea of an indexical representation. So indexical means, you can think of it like by reference to like your index finger. When you use your index finger to point to something, an indexical representation is referring to a local circumstance such that its intelligibility to another person depends on them sharing that context. So it's like the example that Chapman uses is, if you're if I say the eggplant is a straw hat and the spinach is arguing politics, okay, that sentence does not make any sense in the context that you and I are in. Like, what the hell are you talking about? The eggplant is a straw hat. Like, what does that mean? It's like a weird surrealist sentence. Okay, but if you and I are both waiters in a restaurant, and there's a couple sitting at a table, and one of them ordered the eggplant and the other one ordered spinach, and I'm trying to know and you're trying to tell me which person is which dish, that sentence makes perfect fucking sense. Right?
That's brilliant.
Now, the interesting thing about that is that the words are the same. So this challenges this notion of intrinsic representation, right? The words are the same there. The meaning was totally unintelligible in one case, and perfectly intelligible in the other. What did you change? Not the words, but the context in which they're spoken. Okay, so this idea of indexical representation is a representation whose meaning is only interpretable within the context in which it's uttered or whatever else, and that challenges this notion that representation is unto itself sort of intrinsically like things are intrinsically representational. Like the words just do refer to the thing. Well, no, those words don't refer to anything intelligible outside of the particular context in which they're uttered. And most contexts they would be meaningless, but in that context they're perfectly interpretable.
I mean, the sentence as a whole doesn't make sense, but I mean, each individual word is still.
Well, no.
Like I know what straw hat means.
But okay, but what I meant by eggplant in that context was a person, not eggplant. So you might think you know what eggplant means, but it's not what it means in that other case. Like when I say the eggplant is a straw hat,
okay.
You see what I mean? Like it's a person.
Yeah.
It's
okay.
like you could say it's the person who ordered the eggplant, but like that's not what you think the word eggplant means in every case.
Right.
Okay. So you could, there's some cases where it's like it's hard to stretch this, but the point is it's heavily context and purpose dependent what those words even mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to say nothing of the whole sentence in which they're uttered, which is unintelligible outside of that context, right? So that was just to explain what an indexical representation is, but also to challenge this notion that representations are self-interpreting and that they're sort of intrinsically represent what they represent. They don't, right? So how would you make sense of that sentence that I said to you, but for being in the same context with me, engaged in a certain shared practice, we're trying to do the same activity, whatever. That your ability to even interpret the words depends on that, right? So this idea that they're just sort of like interpretable unto themselves doesn't make sense, which also challenges this notion of these sort of perfectly abstract representations.
Right. So how is that? And if this derails the point about general cognition, feel free to ignore it. But how can't that be salvaged by talking about the problem situation from a Popperian lens, or the context is not completely
no.
Okay.
So in an effort to salvage perfect rationalism and representationalism, the definition of a problem situation that gets given in critical rationalism is just the propositional ideas that you have that are in conflict with each other, right? Like, which is just not a helpful way of thinking about it. Like that's not that just assumes that what's going on is still just a bunch of propositional ideas, representations in your head. and somehow the ability to interpret that sentence can be made sense of in terms of other ideas that you have that it's in conflict with, which is not the way, like, that's not what's going on there. I don't know how that explains what's going on there.
Right. You're gonna get death threats, but I love it.
Good. Okay. Which is not to say that the way in which that term problem situation is used by critical rationalists who are trying to sort of deploy critical rationalism as they understand it in the everyday trenches of their behavior, like what they mean by problem situation, often does include things like that whole context. It's just that when you try to get explicit and say, what's happening there under the hood, such that you have a concept of the whole problem situation, this idea that it's just a conflict between representational ideas doesn't hold water. They may be successfully, coping with a problem situation as they understand that, but it doesn't work the way the epistemology says it does, or the combined epistemology philosophy of mind says it does. Okay. So, I brought that up. So we're talking about, in what sense is cognition not fully general? It's clear how what I was just calling reasonableness in Chapman's division is not fully general. It's by definition heavily dependent on context and purposes, and what kind of organism I am, and where I am, and what projects I'm engaged in, etc. Right? Like, that makes sense, right?
Yes.
Cool. Now, so that's reasonableness. Then we have rationality. What he's calling rationality. This is a specific definition of rationality that is defined contra reasonableness as aspiring to context and purpose independence, right? To be as general as it possibly can. Procedures sort of procedures and rules and definite formal ontologies that aspire to be as independent of context and purposes and the sort of narrow concerns of individual agents as possible, right? So the shift from reasonableness to rationality is moving in that direction of generality and universality, right? Now let's take some prototypical examples of what might be called rational in that scheme. So one is counting. Okay, counting is a sort of quintessential rational activity. You've got numbers, which are these ontologically definite, precise entities that you're lining up with the world, and you're just counting how many of something there is. If anything is rational in this sense, that is, right? If anything is general, counting is, right? Or not. I mean, to tell me I'm wrong if this doesn't fit with your sense of what you mean by general. But
no, I'm not sure I've thought deeply about what I mean by that either. But
okay.
just like,
well, let's try it out. Let's try it out.
Yeah, let's try it out.
So counting seems like it should. If I say there are 3 apples, you'll see that there are 3 apples, and insofar as a sheep can count, it sees 3 apples there too, right?
Right.
So counting seems like the kind of thing that especially counting low numbers, for which multiple kinds of animals would have intuitions for. You might have bad intuitions for what 77 looks like, but you might have good intuitions for what 3 looks like, and you can just count 3, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So counting is this sort of quintessential rational activity. There's this story that's in the Eggplant, Chapman's meta-rationality book, called The Parable of the Pebbles, which is about counting and how counting works. Okay. So you've got a shepherd, and the shepherd has a field or a pasture where he keeps his sheep, and he's got a bucket where he has some pebbles. And the way he keeps track of the number of sheep that are in the pasture is every time a sheep leaves the pasture, he takes a pebble out of the bucket. And every time a sheep comes back into the pasture, he puts a pebble back into the bucket, such that the number of pebbles in the bucket represents, quote unquote, notice we're using this word represents, the number of sheep in the pasture, right?
Yep.
So that's like pretty unproblematic. It's like, do you want to find out how many sheep are in the pasture? Count the number of pebbles in the bucket. And think about this, just because it's going to apply when we think about minds. That's representation, right? In as clean a sense of representation as you're ever going to get in some ways. The number of pebbles is the same. It's exactly isomorphic too. It exactly mirrors the number of sheep in the pasture. It represents it perfectly, right?
Right.
And as the number of sheep change, the number of pebbles changes, such that it stays the case over time that the number of pebbles represents the number of sheep in the pasture. Make sense?
Yes, if he's doing a good job, yeah.
Great. And it doesn't matter which shepherd is doing it, right? And it doesn't like it's general in some important sense. It's just counting, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm going to challenge all those intuitions, okay? So if you were going to give an account of why and how those pebbles represent the number of sheep in the pasture, the thing that makes them represent the number of sheep in the pasture is the shepherd. It's the ongoing activity of the shepherd, perceiving the number of sheep there, perceiving the number of pebbles, perceiving what counts as a sheep in this ontological sense, what counts as a pebble. Is that little piece of pebble that chipped off of the pebble still a pebble? Is it its own pebble suddenly? He's got to make those discriminations and decide, nope, that's just a piece of dust. That's a pebble, etc. To keep track of the relationship between those two. And then he's got to steward the relationship between the pebbles in the bucket and the sheep, such that as the sheep move around, he's keeping track, right? So the pebbles on their own don't represent anything. If the shepherd went away, suddenly it's just some pebbles in a bucket, right? Like if I gave you a bucket with some pebbles and I said, "What does this represent?" You'd have no idea. I'd be like, "Tell me what this is about," and you'd be like, "What the hell are you talking about? It's just pebbles in a bucket." You know what I mean? Like, it's just a bucket full of pebbles. And if I took that and put it halfway across the world in some other context, independent of the thing that the shepherd was using it for, suddenly the bucket full of pebbles is just a bucket full of pebbles. And this idea that it's a representational object, that it has intentionality, goes away. Okay?
Yes.
Okay. So now here's the sort of one of the ways you can get it to flip. Okay, this sort of shift in understanding. The representations in your own mind are like the pebbles. And so the question is, what do you do? How could you steward the relationship between those things and the world such that they stay in touch with the world, like the shepherd does for the pebbles, without giving a sort of circular infinite regress explanation? Oh, because you have representations. You see what I mean?
Well, can you explain that in a slightly different way?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm gonna say it again in a different way. The same thing.
Yeah.
So with the shepherd and the pebbles, you got this idea that the pebbles represent the number of sheep in the pasture, but the shepherd is the one who keeps track of the relationship such that they continue to represent it.
Yes, the pebble isn't inherently about the sheep in any objective sense.
Exactly.
It's
Exactly.
the ongoing activity of the shepherd
that makes
creating that representation.
Yeah. Exactly.
He creates the intentionality between.
Right. And so in philosophy of mind jargon, this would be called derived intentionality. It's in virtue of the shepherd's interpretation of it as such that the pebbles are about the sheep, not original intentionality, intrinsic intentionality to the pebbles. Make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. The same question can be asked: where do our mental representations get their intentionality from? Okay. What makes neurons intrinsically representational in a way that pebbles aren't?
But okay, so I have to play with this out loud a little bit, just to,
yeah, please.
So let's do a trivial example. So it's getting late here. I'm getting hungry.
Mm-hmm.
and my stomach made a noise when I said that. It was perfect timing. And so I'm thinking about, okay, what's in the fridge? And yeah, so let's say I want some oat yogurt because I'm trying not to eat dairy or whatever. Then I have an image in my mind that looks like the oat yogurt. Can't you say the resemblance, the fact that the image looks like the actual oat yogurt makes it representative of it in a way where a pebble doesn't look anything like a sheep? Or there's something about my representation about the oat yogurt that's different in my mind.
Yeah. So the sort of invoked this concept of isomorphism, right? Which is like sharing shapes. You can like they have the same shape in some sense, right?
Yes.
And really it's about correspondence. It's like, the pebbles may not look like the sheep, but the number of pebbles is the same as the number of sheep. So in that sense, they are isomorphic to each other.
Yes.
Right. And in the same way, your mental image is not exactly the same as the thing in the world, but it somehow shares the shape of the thing in the world. There's some parallel between what's in the world and the thing in your head is the idea, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so first off, you don't know that because you don't know what's in the world. You know the thing in your head. You right? So you don't know that. Second, the idea that something intrinsically looks a particular way doesn't make any sense. Looking is a perceptual activity. Something can't look like anything, but from a particular vantage point for an organism with a particular sort of perceptual faculty, namely the ability to see, which is the ability to like transduce light energy into neural firings, right? Like intrinsically looking like something doesn't really make any sense as an idea. You see what I mean?
Okay, so now we're really bumping up against intuitions here, where I need to take it slow.
Okay, well, just even simpler. The way something looks to me is different than the way that it looks to you when you're sitting on the other side of the room.
But we would both agree about what was the oat yogurt in the fridge, presumably.
Correct. But the visual representation of the scene would be different because we're sitting in different places. So what something looks like at the very minimum is dependent on where you're sitting.
Right. Yes. At least, yeah, the minutiae of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then that goes way further down than that. The reason why you and I both know it's oat yogurt has a lot to do with the fact that you and I are both human beings. And I don't even know what oat yogurt is. I've never heard that term. But I would probably be able to point it out because I know what yogurt is. Whatever. But like, there are all sorts of specifics that you and I share that makes that intelligible. It's like the indexical representation again. It's like you and I having in common the situation of being waiters in a restaurant makes that sentence interpretable to me. Likewise, if you and I are in the same room, I have background knowledge about what yogurt is. There's all this stuff that would be brought to bear in my ability to parse in the same way that you do what's the oat yogurt in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not intrinsically given in the oat yogurt. But we're getting far afield. I want to go back to the parable of the pebbles here. So the idea is that the shepherd stewards the relationship between the rational representation and the world in the case of the pebbles. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
The shepherd guarantees that the number of pebbles corresponds to the number of sheep accurately in an ongoing way.
Yes.
We have this idea that we have rational representations of that kind. And I think we do, right? So like, I might have in my head the number of sheep, right?
Yeah.
Like some counter, that's like, there are 6 sheep here, right? And when one leaves, I decrement my counter. And when one comes back, I increment it,
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like the pebbles, but in the head, right? Instead of in pebble language, it's represented as neural symbols or whatever, like mind symbols. Okay.
Yes.
How do I keep track of the relationship of the representation and the world successfully? And you can't you can't refer to representations, because that is like a circular explanation. You see what I mean? I have to be able to steward the relationship between my own internal pebbles and the world without referring to representations. Like the representations in my head are no more intrinsically about the world than are the pebbles. It's the activity, the ongoing dynamic interactivity with the environment that makes them about the world. In the same way that the ongoing activity of the shepherd makes the pebbles about the world. Just put the pebbles in his head. It's the same thing. He's got to do things.
Mm. So, right. So you're saying that the link between the mental representation and what it's supposed to represent.
The link between that perfectly context and purpose independent representation, just the number. So we're originally talking about reasonableness and rationality, right? In Chapman's Causality. So a perfect quintessentially rational activity is counting. Okay, just keeping track of the number of something. Okay, and the number of something is a perfectly rational objective representation. So it seems, and yet to ground that to that thing's relationship to the world, you have to be able to do things interacting with that world that don't depend on your already being able to do the representation thing, because that's what we're trying to explain. The number in your head is no more intrinsically about the sheep than the pebbles were when they were in the bucket. Right? It's the activity of the shepherd to keep track of that relationship.
Right. So an ongoing interaction that creates the connection between the mental representation and what it supposedly represents.
Yeah.
It's not inherent to the representation.
Yes. Exactly so. The meaning is not intrinsic to the representation.
But what am I doing then if we go back to the brain in a vat idea?
Yep.
What's going on when I'm laying in a sensory deprivation tank?
Well, when you're laying in a separate sensory deprivation tank, good luck keeping track of the relationship between pebbles and sheep. You're in a separate sensory deprivation tank.
Right, but I can. But what does it mean when I think? But what does it mean to think about something? Like if I'm laying in the sensory deprivation tank, I can think about presumably anything, and I will understand what I'm thinking about. Like in my mind's eye, I'm representing something that I'm not actually causally coupled with at that very moment.
Yes.
It seems like I'm representing things.
Yes.
But are you saying that's just a special case of what you just said? I'm still ongoingly.
No, I'm saying the ability for that kind of thing to be about the world, in general, depends on. Well, it's different for different kinds of facts. But so take you're lying in the sensory deprivation tank, and you're thinking about Paris is the capital of France. Right. You're not locally causally coupled to Paris being the capital of France. Doesn't make sense what it would mean to say that you're locally causally coupled to it. Okay.
Yeah.
You haven't fully divorced yourself from some embedded embodied situation. You're still you where you are in the sensory deprivation tank. And the meaning of that thought, Paris is the capital of France, depends on lots of things. Background knowledge and facts about you and facts about being human and etc. Right. So yes, it's not dependent on exactly the environment of the sensory deprivation tank, but the way you're thinking about it at that given time is still embedded. You're still you in a particular place at a particular time, right? Thinking particular kinds of thoughts. And the sentence "Paris is the capital of France" could mean different things in different contexts, right? So it's going to mean something that's in a certain sense context dependent. But yes, I agree with you that it's about something that you're not locally causally coupled to, namely Paris. But that in a certain sense like grounds out in a whole socially distributed network of activity that goes beyond you. It's not just a matter, like, the meaning is not pre-given. You understand it because you've been enculturated into that sort of those cultural patterns of activity and what the words mean. Like, maybe this would be a good time to go. The second way in after Heidegger was going to be Wittgenstein. We sort of skipped over it, but this is about language.
Oh,
But, yeah.
okay. Yeah.
Does any of that make sense? Do you get what I mean when I say you're still sort of embedded when you're lying in a sensory deprivation tank? Like, it's not like you're outside of time and space. You're still you in your body thinking. Like,
Yeah.
the words mean exactly what they mean
absolutely.
to you right now, which is a little bit different than what they mean to me.
Yes, but I still am not fully grasping how me laying in there thinking about I don't know, my wife, like I'm still seeing imagery that to me is representing her.
It is. I agree.
Yeah. Okay.
The question is, what is the meaning of a representation? And okay, let's talk about Wittgenstein. This might help.
Let's do it.
And just to be clear, I'm not disputing that when you're lying in the sensory deprivation tank thinking about your wife, that the meaning is in fact about her. But I'm saying that meaning grounds out in, depends upon, etc. The meaning of the words that you're using in your head, and even the images, grounds out in a certain kind of concrete interaction. And we're going to talk about Wittgenstein to talk about the language piece of that. Okay.
Right. Yep.
And just one thing to keep in the back of one's mind here. So, Chapman, and this was one of Cosra's questions, I think, too. And this is a question that people often have about Chapman, is he often stresses that meaning is neither subjective nor objective, but interactive. We've talked about some senses in which that's the case already. So in the case of perception, we talked about how causality is constantly passing back and forth between inside and outside, between the organism and the environment, such that one's perceptions are coupled to that environment and are about it, mean something about it. Now we're going to talk about language, and how the meaning of language is constituted by interaction, which was Wittgenstein's sort of discovery. Okay, so Wittgenstein, are you still with me? You good?
Yep. And I just want to mention actually that it's funny that Wittgenstein is kind of like the prototypical bad philosopher in David Deutsch's Beginning of Infinity. So I've always just been like, okay, fuck Wittgenstein. I have no idea what he's saying, but it's bad. So I'm very interested to hear what you have to say here. Yes.
Some of that is probably Wittgenstein's fault, in the sense of, like, he wrote in this strange way, and he sort of like played up his own mysticism a little bit, maybe, and gave, I think one can be forgiven for taking away the impression that he's like, just talking about how we can't really reason about anything, but something much more interesting is going on there. So then certainly Deutsch alludes to in Beginning of Infinity. So, okay, Wittgenstein started out working in the logical positivist tradition. And just to orient people with respect to stuff we've already talked about, so you have two sort of streams in philosophy, in terms of thinking about epistemology and philosophy of mind, which are rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism says we get our knowledge from innate ideas and from reasoning, and empiricism says we get our knowledge from the senses. Okay, so these are sort of like, long-standing traditions in philosophy. When you get to logical positivism, it's an attempt to sort of marry those two traditions. So the logical coming out of the rationalist tradition, and the positivism coming out of, to some degree, the empiricist tradition, and say, we're going to turn all of our knowledge into logical statements, and we're going to, say that only those things that can be verified only those statements that can be verified are meaningful. That's the positivism piece. And then we're going to have all our knowledge on a firm foundation, so to speak. And that's the logical positivist project. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And so Wittgenstein was doing his philosophizing kind of in this tradition, and Popper was also working in reaction to this tradition to some degree. Wittgenstein's first book, the Tractatus, was sort of carrying the suppositions of logical positivism to their sort of extreme endpoint. So he's talking about language, and he's asking this question of how words get their meaning, and he's like, in order for words to be meaningful about the world, they've got to somehow regularities in the sentences, in the sentence structure, and in the words have to mirror regularities in the world in some way. And so he comes up with this picture theory of language, which is like words are kind of pictures of the world, and our statements are meaningful insofar as we kind of order these pictures of the world into orderly sentences or whatever, and everything that isn't a picture of the world in language is meaningless, right? And that's the sort of conclusion he comes to in the Tractatus. I'm simplifying a lot, but that's the general view.
Right.
Okay, and that's taking this logical positivist view of what knowledge is, what meaning is, to its conclusion, which is just like, all those concepts that don't seem to be pictures of the world, like justice and like exclamations like "ouch" or whatever else. That's just meaningless, because that can't be reduced to these logical statements that are meaningful in virtue of their representational content, so to speak, right? Like the senses in which they're pictures of the world.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. So, in Wittgenstein's second book, The Philosophical Investigations, he, or I don't think it's I think it's just Philosophical Investigations. He realizes that was all mistaken, and that the whole view of logical positivism is wrong, and comes to a different view, which is, and so he's talking about the meaning of language, but everything he says about the meaning of language also applies in some senses to the meaning of the thoughts in our heads, which are sometimes expressed in language. But so it's just as much about our minds as it is about the words. Okay. And there are many different ways he gets into this, but well, okay, so we already talked about one, but in a different way. So one of the thought experiments he raises in the investigations is this idea of a game. So if I were to tell you, ask you to define for me precisely what a game is, you'd find that there are things that you'd want to call games that wouldn't be captured by that definition, and there are things that would meet that definition that you wouldn't want to call games. And so when you're trying to figure out what constitutes a game, the category of game is defined by a certain kind of, his term is family resemblance, not by some explicit set of rules that you have for what is and isn't a game, and it's sort of fuzzy along the boundaries. Some things are kind of a game. Some things that seem definitive of games, like that they're competitive, aren't true of games like solitaire, so there are all these things, all these senses in which this category of game is fuzzy, right? And the things that are in the category are only related to each other in this family resemblance, imperfectly specifiable way. And that's part of getting at this intuition that the meaning of our concepts is not perfectly definitely precise, context independent, pre-given, rule specified, etc. Right? That's like it's something fuzzier is going on there, right?
Right.
And the view that he eventually comes to in the investigations is that this whole idea that this whole intuitive idea that we have, that you have when you're in the sensory deprivation tank thinking about your wife, that thoughts and language intrinsically represent what they are about, which is to say that what they're about is contained in the words somehow. He realizes that that view is like untenable, that doesn't make sense. And we've talked about a lot of the reasons why already. I can take a sentence like the eggplant is a straw hat and the spinach is arguing politics, and all those words mean something different than they would mean in a different context. And they're the same words. And your ability to interpret what those words mean is wholly dependent on context. And so the same thing is true that is true of those words, like eggplant and spinach in that sentence, is true of the thoughts in your head, right? Like, or to put it a different way, it's true of the patterns of neural firing in your head that you would want to call a representation, right? There's nothing about the neurons on their own that makes them about the thing in the world they're supposed to be about. Even isomorphism, like even sharing the shape, even if they, to what we were talking about before, like look like the thing in the world, they're about their connectedness to the world, their meaning, their reference. I mean, like there are clouds that look like elephants, but those clouds aren't necessarily representations of elephants. You see what I mean?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
And it can be a representation of an elephant if you are playing a game where the purpose of the game is to find the animals in the clouds. Yeah.
You can interpret it to be one, but notice how that determinatively depends on you being there to interpret it as such.
Yeah. No, that's what I was pointing at. Exactly.
Yeah. So you can think, one way of thinking about it is that like all the representations in your head are kind of like the clouds. So what's the activity of interpretation? Like how do you get the interpretation of them? If their ability to be about something in the world depends on a given interpretation, which can change. Kind of makes sense.
Yeah,
I haven't answered the question of how, but that's, you see how that's a question. Like, given that words don't intrinsically what they mean, given that shapes, like the elephant-shaped cloud doesn't mean what they mean. The same thing is true of the patterns of neural firing in your head. They don't intrinsically mean what they mean. So how do they get their meaning then?
It's conjectural.
Well, that's a bit circular, right? I mean,
I know.
Yeah. No, but I guess I'm trying to break out of the frame where this seems unproblematic. Do you see why that's kind of problematic? Like that why that's a question?
Yes.
Okay. So and there are 1,000 examples of this. A stop sign. A stop sign means something specific to you. If you'd never heard of English and English didn't exist as a language, the stop sign might look exactly the same and it doesn't mean what it means anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So we're starting to get this sense that meaning can't be quote unquote objective in the sense of inhering in the object. And it can't be subjective in the sense of being totally arbitrary.
And can you explicate again how this shows us that representationalism, representational theory of mind can't be the right one?
Well, so just because it doesn't answer the question how our representations get their meanings.
Okay, so it's just saying that representations is the claim that they are inherently meaningful, and let's just start from there, more or less.
Yeah, they're not inherently meaningful, but yes, that is the sort of many representationalists, so to speak, take the inherent meaning of their representations for granted. Like,
yeah, exactly.
When Deutsch talks about we're just making conjectures, the fact that those conjectures mean something about the world is taken to be an intrinsic property of those conjectures. In other words, it doesn't have, we test our ideas, but the ongoing dynamic interaction is not like, you can have, conjectures that are abstract propositions living in fairyland that have never interacted with anything. And for him, they mean what they mean.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to make problematic this idea that words or symbols or anything that has meaning or, mental representations, anything that we take to have meaning, I want to make problematic this idea, this assumption that meaning is intrinsic to the thing. Because it's shaped the way that it is, it automatically means what it means. That's not true. We've seen how it's not true with words. Words can mean anything in different contexts, right? Eggplant is a straw hat. finishes arguing politics. Those words mean something totally different in that context than they would in another context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen how it's true of things that are sort of a certain shape, like the cloud in the sky that's shaped like an elephant. It's only a representation of an elephant in some sense when taken to be such. And it's not going to be a representation of an elephant for long because it's going to change shape when the elephant doesn't change shape. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the same thing, and this is the crucial idea, is true of your mental representations. Same thing that's true of language, same thing that's true of the cloud is true of your mental representations. It's a particular way. That particular way might be isomorphic in some sense to the thing in the world it's ostensibly about, but its meaning, it's sort of it's being about that thing is not intrinsic to it. You know, it could be interpreted differently.
Yeah.
To mean something totally different.
Yeah, this is a trip, man.
Okay, but does it kind of make sense that that's problematic?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is what Wittgenstein is puzzling over, right? In he's like, what the fuck? Clearly it's not like the picture theory, right? Because a different interpretation would make the words mean something totally different, so it can't just be a picture. And clearly it's not these like perfectly definite meanings. And clearly our categories aren't these like perfectly discrete, explicitly defined things. So what the hell is going on? How do our words get their meaning? And the view that he comes up with is, well, first off, you start thinking of language rather than being more like a picture, it's like a tool, right? And this is clear to see when we're talking about, words like, or like things like, things like ouch, right? Ouch is an exclamation, right? It's not about the world in the sense of being a picture of the world. It's an exclamation to accomplish a particular purpose, which is to like indicate that I'm in pain or something like that, or like to like alleviate my pain by just like yelping, right, or something like that. So in the extreme case, you got something like ouch, right? Okay, but even things like the word cup or the word dog or the word game do kind of function as tools for communicating within a linguistic community. Okay. And the meanings that those words have come from what Wittgenstein calls the forms of life within that community, like the practices of that community, the way the word is used. And this is this idea of meaning is use. This is a sort of Wittgensteinian aphorism. And he doesn't say it that categorically, but it's like meaning in many cases is use. The meaning of the word is how it's used in a particular linguistic community. Okay. So like if around here we use the word dog to refer to those furry things, that's what the meaning is. But if we use the word dog differently, it would mean something different. So it's not intrinsic to the sound dog. It's not intrinsic to the letters. It comes from how we use it in a particular social context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. But so is this in direct conflict with the idea that language is theories, like our concepts are theories that we have to solve particular problems, like in the Deutsch conception?
Yes. It's not all like we're trying to explain representation, and there's this like backdoor effort to explain representation as being secretly representation. So it's like yes. I get that, it's problematic to say that this is a representation. Our words are tools, and tools are actually just theories. And what are theories? They're representations. It's like no, we're trying to break out of the view that it's all just representations all the way down secretly.
Okay. Yeah.
This is the sort of equivocation. This is why I was saying we don't necessarily want to talk about genes as being conjectures of a certain kind. Not that that isn't a certain way of speaking, that there's this sort of trial and error process, but clearly genes aren't propositions. They're not representations. An arm is not a representation in it's like it's an arm. You know what I mean? Which is not to say that it's not related to the niche, but it's not related to the niche in the sense of being an objective representation of it. If an arm is an objective representation, what does objective even mean? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So yeah, I want to resist the idea that tools are secretly theories. I mean, like, I think that's confusing, because what we're trying to explain is how theories get their meaning, and turning it into tools has the virtue of grounding it in action and purposes and context, which gets us closer to what the amoeba is doing or these simple organisms are doing. And then suddenly we have an account of cognition that doesn't depend on magic, right? Like, we're just down to mechanism and behavior, and you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So to loop us all the way back to where we started with the ethno-methodological flip, ethno-methodology studies how, you know, people make sense in concrete situations as publicly observable activity. It's like a thing that they're doing. So it's like how they use the words, but it's also other activities that they're doing. And so it's taking it out of abstract cognition land and bringing it down to the level of concrete behaviors that exhibit a certain orderliness. So it's not as though there's no pattern to how people use the word dog. Clearly there is. But that's the patterns. Those patterns emerge over a whole social community into which you get enculturated, such that you learn that that's what the word dog means, which is to say how that word functions.
Yeah.
And then in your own mind, this is part of what leads to the confusion, you know, because when you're using the word dog in your own mind, it seems to intrinsically mean what it means, right? Like, that's what produces this confusion, is it doesn't seem to depend on the social community when you use it in your own head. So Wittgenstein has this whole, like, you know, you can't have a private language argument. Yes, now when you use the word dog in your head, it means what it means. But that's because you've been enculturated into how that word is used.
So that's to come back to my laying in a deprivation tank thing. It's not as independent as I make it out to be in my own mind because of that reason. Okay. Now, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay. Well, maybe that's enough for people to chew on for one episode. I hope you know that these things are all related. You know, it's just sometimes it takes, you know, 5 or 6 different ways in, because you got to talk about language and you got to talk about activity and you got to talk about cognition, representation, and all this stuff. So
and I mean, at least the way it works for me in these conversations, it's like I get a puzzle piece here and there. When you're saying something and something clicks, and then you say it from another angle, something else clicks, and then go back, say that thing again. You know, it's an ongoing thing, right? And it's not linear, by any means.
That's what makes it very hard to make the flip. Is you know, another just I'll leave this as a kind of cliffhanger for next time. But like, another thing that's happening here is we're getting out of a view that epistemology is a single thing. You know, like there's one thing of which you can have a theory, and that is the theory of epistemology as such. And it's like, no, the way you know different things is different. You know, the way you see is different than the way you use language is different than the way you know, etc. Right? So part of the reason why building the understanding depends on all these specific examples is that it's not like a single general theory of epistemology as such. And in fact, it's saying that such a theory doesn't make sense. It's like that's the wrong way of thinking about it. You know, it's not, which isn't to say that there aren't patterns that emerge across it, like, for example, this idea that meaning resides in interaction. But it's just you're not going to find the theory that is the simple version of it. You know,
that is a really good cliffhanger, and that's something that I've been kind of biting my tongue this whole time, because the epistemology part, this part that you just mentioned is also one of the hardest things for me to really grasp. So I'm really psyched to do the next episode as well. And I'm going to listen back to this and digest it a few times. And yeah, the most shocking thing for me in the whole episode was that you have never heard of oat yogurt, dude.
I know.
What's wrong with you, man?
this alone proves that, you know, words don't have intrinsic meanings. I have no idea what you're talking about by oat yogurt.
Yeah. No, that's great, man. I appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, this is fucking awesome. I'm excited to hear what questions people have for next time, what they took away from this. And yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And we'll get questions the next time. It'd probably be good to talk about, like, okay, now that we've problematized cognitivism and rationalism and representationalism, all these ways, then what? You know, like
exactly.
Yeah. How do we restore some sense that, you know, knowledge and progress and whatever else are possible? So that's certainly doable, but we can talk about that. And I'm very eager to hear whether any of what I said makes sense to anybody, and if there are things that people want clarified. So yeah,
that's awesome, man. All right, until then, take care.